I had just wrapped up my shift at the mall, dead tired and craving nothing more than my bed. It was one of those nights where the air felt thick, and the streets outside were unusually quiet. My rideshare app buzzed with a notification. My driver, Samir, was pulling up in a dark gray sedan. He seemed friendly enough when I got in, greeting me with a warm smile and making small talk about how late it was. I barely responded, too exhausted to hold a conversation, and instead focused on the thought of being home soon. About 5 minutes into the ride, I started to notice we weren't taking the usual route. I had worked late shifts enough times to know the main roads well, but this time, we were winding through smaller, unfamiliar streets. I asked if this was a shortcut, and he quickly reassured me that it was a faster way with less traffic. Something about the response felt rehearsed, and I couldn't shake the unease that began to creep in. When I glanced at his phone on the dashboard, I realized his GPS wasn't even on, and the knot in my stomach tightened. I tried to convince myself that maybe he knew the area well, that seasoned drivers didn't always rely on GPS. But the streets we were taking grew darker and more isolated with each turn. The soft glow of the city lights was now behind us, replaced by dim streetlights spaced too far apart to offer any real visibility. Houses became sparse, and soon there was nothing but long stretches of empty road surrounded by shadowy trees. My exhaustion was quickly giving way to a heightened awareness of every little detail, the faint sound of the engine, the smell of air freshener, and the slight creak every time the car turned. That's when I noticed the doors. I had always assumed that rideshare cars automatically locked once the trip started, but these locks seemed different. I tested the handle on my side, casually pulling on it, and my stomach dropped when it didn't budge. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably a safety feature, but the tension in my chest was hard to ignore. Something about the way the driver sat, his grip firm on the wheel, made it feel like he was too focused, like he wasn't just driving, but planning. As the minutes dragged on, I became hyper-aware of everything around me. The driver wasn't saying much anymore, his earlier friendliness replaced by a tense silence. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, but I could see his jaw clenching every so often, like he was deep in thought. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into darkness, and I realized I hadn't seen another car for a while. It was just us, the hum of the tires against the asphalt, and the growing sense that something was very wrong. I tried to discreetly check my phone, hoping to share my location or text someone, but there was no signal. My palms started to sweat as I gripped my bag tighter. Suddenly, the car slowed down, and I instinctively held my breath. We were pulling onto a dirt path that disappeared into a wooded area. I asked why we were leaving the main road, trying to keep my voice steady, but he simply mumbled something about avoiding construction. My heart was pounding now, every instinct screaming that I needed to get out of the car. I looked at the lock again, wishing I had tested it earlier, and tried to calculate how fast I could react if the chance to escape came. The trees loomed closer, their shadows swallowing the faint moonlight, and the car finally came to a stop. The engine cut off, and the sudden silence was deafening. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I stared out at the dark, wooded surroundings. There wasn't a single sign of civilization, no streetlights, no houses, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. The driver sat still for a moment, his hands resting on the wheel, and I could feel his gaze shifting toward me. My fingers hovered near the door handle again, testing it as quietly as possible, but it wouldn't budge. Panic started to take hold, and I racked my brain for what to do next. Running seemed impossible in this darkness, and screaming felt futile with no one around to hear. Without a word, he reached for something in the passenger seat. I couldn't make out what it was, but the motion alone sent adrenaline surging through my body. My breathing quickened as I glanced down at my phone again, hoping for even a flicker of service, but the screen mocked me with its blank bars. Every second stretched into an eternity as I tried to process the situation. I didn't know if he was waiting for me to make the first move or if he had already decided what would happen next, but the air in the car felt suffocating, thick with tension and fear. He finally turned to face me fully, his expression calm but eerily unreadable. In the dim light of the car's interior, I could see his eyes studying me, as if he were weighing something in his mind. My instincts screamed at me to stay composed, to not show the fear that was bubbling up inside. I asked him why we had stopped, trying to sound more curious than scared, but my voice wavered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, still holding whatever he had grabbed from the passenger seat. The moment felt endless, my pulse pounding so hard I thought he could probably hear it. When he finally spoke, his tone was unnervingly casual, as if this were a perfectly normal situation. He said he needed to check something in the trunk and stepped out of the car, shutting the door firmly behind him. The sound of the door slamming jolted me into action. I quickly scanned the car for anything I could use, a tool, a lever, anything to override the locks, but the interior was spotless. Through the window, I saw him walking to the back of the car, his movements deliberate and slow. My hands were shaking as I pulled at the door handle again, praying for some kind of miracle, but it didn't budge. The sound of the trunk opening sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't see what he was doing back there, but the faint rustling noises filled the air, each one making my heart race faster. Every instinct told me I couldn't stay in the car any longer. I reached for the window controls, hoping they might work even if the doors were locked. The window rolled down just enough for me to slip my fingers through, and I started pushing it down manually with all the strength I had. The glass moved painfully slow, but it was enough to give me a sliver of hope. I kept glancing toward the back of the car, terrified he would notice what I was doing. As soon as the gap was wide enough, I shoved my arm through and fumbled for the exterior door handle. My fingers finally brushed against it, and with a desperate pull, the door popped open. I didn't think, I just ran. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I barely felt it as I sprinted toward the trees. The ground was uneven, branches snagging at my legs and tearing at my clothes, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear his voice calling out, calm and measured at first, but then louder, angrier. It was only then I realized he wasn't just calling, he was chasing me. The sound of his footsteps behind me was terrifyingly close. They were heavy, deliberate, and getting louder with each second. The woods were pitch black, and I could barely see where I was going, but I kept running, my hands outstretched to shield my face from low-hanging branches. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, my chest burning as panic fueled my every step. I tripped over something, maybe a root or a rock, and hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air out of me. For a split second, I thought about staying down, but then I heard him call out again, his voice sharp and furious, and I scrambled back to my feet. I didn't know where I was running to, I just needed to put as much distance between us as possible. My mind raced with possibilities. Could I find a road? A house? Anything that could mean safety? The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows twisting and moving in the faint moonlight, but I pushed forward. Suddenly, I spotted a faint glow in the distance. It was small, maybe the size of a flashlight beam, and it didn't look like it was coming from him. Hope surged through me as I changed direction, running toward the light with every ounce of strength I had left. As I got closer to the light, I realized it was coming from a small cabin nestled deep in the woods. The glow came from a single window, faint but steady, like the light of an old lamp. I didn't stop to think, I ran straight for it, pounding on the door with both fists as hard as I could. My voice cracked as I yelled for help, my desperation echoing into the still night. There was no response. The cabin looked abandoned, but the light told me someone had to be inside. I banged on the door again, my eyes darting back toward the direction I had come from, half expecting to see him emerging from the darkness. When no one answered, I made a split-second decision and pushed on the door. To my relief, it creaked open. The inside was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The cabin was bare except for an old table and chair, a few scattered tools, and the lamp that had drawn me here. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I slid the bolt into place. My heart was still racing, but for the first time since I ran, I felt a small flicker of safety. That feeling didn't last long. I noticed something odd. The tools on the table looked recently used, and there was an open bag on the floor, half filled with items that didn't belong in a cabin this far out. Clothes. A phone charger. A set of keys. I stared at the bag, my mind struggling to make sense of it. Those weren't the kinds of things you'd expect to find in a place like this, especially not so neatly packed, like someone had left in a hurry or was planning to come back. A cold realization settled over me. This wasn't just some random cabin. Someone had been staying here, and they had personal belongings, things that didn't belong in the middle of nowhere. My eyes darted to the tools on the table. There was a hammer, some rope, and what looked like duct tape. My stomach churned as the pieces started to come together, and a wave of nausea hit me when I noticed faint stains on the wood near the table. I didn't want to look closer. I didn't want to know. Before I could process anything further, I heard footsteps outside, crunching against the leaves. My breath caught in my throat. He had found me. The doorknob rattled, first softly, then with more force. My entire body froze as I stared at the door, praying the lock would hold. He didn't say anything, no threats, no taunts, just the sound of him testing the door, pushing against it. The silence in between each attempt was worse than the noise. My mind raced, and I realized I had no plan if he got in. I looked around the cabin for anything I could use to defend myself, my hands trembling as they landed on the hammer. It was small, but it was better than nothing. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, each sound reverberating through the cramped space. My skin prickled as if the air itself had turned electric, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to do something. The hammer felt almost useless in my grip now, a feeble defense against whatever was out there, or in here. I turned my head slowly toward the direction of the sound, my breaths shallow and uneven, feeling the oppressive darkness pressing closer. I reached out blindly with my free hand, trying to steady myself against the wall, when I felt something soft brush against my fingers. It wasn't wood. It felt like hair. A strangled gasp escaped me, and I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something solid. I hit the ground hard, the hammer clattering out of my hand. The whispers that had been faint before now seemed to swirl around me, overlapping in a chaotic, unintelligible murmur that made my head throb. My vision swam as I scrambled to retrieve the hammer, every muscle in my body trembling with fear. I felt paralyzed by the crushing realization that I wasn't alone in the room. There was something else here with me, something I couldn't see but could almost feel, its presence thick in the air, its proximity suffocating. The footsteps stopped again, and this time, the silence felt like a weight pressing down on me. I strained to hear anything, movement, breathing, even the crunch of leaves, but there was nothing. My mind spiraled with possibilities. Was he still out there? Was he circling around the cabin, looking for another way in? I took a step back from the door, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving to the side of the cabin. He was checking the windows. I turned toward the small window by the table, where the light was spilling out into the woods. My heart sank as I realized I hadn't covered it, and it was the only thing betraying my location. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I crouched behind the table, gripping the hammer so tightly my knuckles ached. The light from the lamp flickered slightly, casting strange shadows across the walls, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement outside the window. My breath hitched as I stared at the glass, expecting to see his face at any moment. The cabin felt smaller by the second, like the walls were closing in, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he found a way in. The footsteps stopped once again, but this time, they were replaced by a sound I hadn't expected, a faint creak from behind me. My blood ran cold as I realized the source wasn't outside the cabin, it was inside. I whipped around, the hammer raised, my eyes straining to see anything in the dim light. The whispers had returned, louder now, almost deafening, as if they were coming from every direction at once. I couldn't understand them, but the tone was clear, malicious and taunting. My grip on the hammer faltered, and for the first time, I felt completely powerless. The knocking at the door suddenly stopped, replaced by silence so profound it felt unnatural. I stayed frozen, listening intently, but there was no more movement outside. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the room, the oppressive darkness feeling alive, as though it was watching me. Then I heard it again, a faint, deliberate knock, this time from inside the room. My stomach dropped, and I turned my head toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just the empty, suffocating blackness. I didn't dare move. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where could I go? I backed away from the direction of the sound, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stay upright. My hand brushed against something on the floor, and I realized it was the vent cover I had dislodged earlier. Desperation took over as I dropped to my knees and scrambled to the vent. The thought of crawling into the confined space made my chest tighten, but it was my only option. I shoved myself inside, pulling the cover back into place as quietly as I could. The whispers didn't fade as I moved deeper into the vent, the cold metal pressing against my scraped arms and knees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, even in this cramped, suffocating tunnel. I crawled forward, each movement slow and deliberate, my body aching with every scrape against the cold metal walls. The whispers seemed to echo inside the vent, growing louder and more chaotic, but I forced myself to focus on the faint sliver of light ahead. The air was thick with dust, making it harder to breathe, but the promise of escape pushed me forward. When I finally reached the opening, I saw it was partially obscured by roots and vines that had crept in from outside. I pressed against the cover, my arms shaking with the effort, and after a few agonizing moments, it popped loose. I tumbled out of the vent and onto the forest floor, gasping for air. The cold dampness of the ground seeped through my clothes, but I didn't care, I was out. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to breathe, staring up at the canopy of trees that blocked out most of the moonlight. Then the reality of my situation hit me again. The cabin loomed behind me, a menacing silhouette against the night. My mind screamed at me to move, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I pushed myself up on shaky legs and began stumbling through the woods, not caring where I was going as long as it was away. The forest seemed endless, the shadows stretching out like they were alive. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him or something else. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I saw a break in the trees, and with it, the faint glow of streetlights. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled toward the road, my breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. When I finally reached the asphalt, I collapsed to my knees, my body trembling from fear and exhaustion. A pickup truck appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I waved frantically, and to my immense relief, it slowed down and stopped. The driver, a middle-aged man, looked at me with a mix of concern and confusion as I stumbled toward the window. I could barely speak, my words coming out in broken fragments, but he seemed to understand enough to let me in. I climbed into the passenger seat, locking the door behind me and begging him to drive. As we pulled away, I kept my eyes glued to the forest, half expecting to see something, or someone, emerge from the shadows. When we reached the police station, I practically fell out of the truck, my legs barely supporting me. The driver explained to the officers what he knew, which wasn't much, and they quickly ushered me inside. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, I tried to recount everything that had happened, but my words felt jumbled, my thoughts still racing. I told them about the rideshare driver, the strange detour, the cabin, and my escape through the vent. As I spoke, I could see the officers exchanging looks, their initial concerns slowly shifting into skepticism. They asked if I could remember anything about the car, license plate, make, or model, but my mind was a blur. All I could describe was the driver's unsettling calmness and the way he had deliberately locked me in. One officer stepped out to make a call, while another stayed with me, offering reassurances that felt hollow. They promised to search the area and contact the rideshare company, but even as they spoke, I could feel their doubts. Sitting there in the sterile, brightly lit station, I felt safe for the first time in hours, but it was a fragile safety. The thought of him still out there, planning his next move, was enough to make my hands tremble. The next morning, I got a call from the police. They told me they had searched the area I described but found nothing, no cabin, no dirt path, no broken vent. It was like the place didn't exist. My protests were met with polite but firm explanations about how dense forests can be deceiving, how I might have misremembered the location in my panic. When I asked about the rideshare account, their tone grew even grimmer. The account was fake, no traceable information, no records beyond my initial booking. It was as if the driver had disappeared into thin air, leaving no evidence behind. Weeks passed with no updates, and the case was quietly dropped. The world moved on, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that car, watching the trees blur past, feeling the suffocating dread of being trapped. I stopped using rideshares altogether, walking or taking the bus no matter how inconvenient it was. Even now, months later, the fear hasn't gone away. Every shadow feels like a threat, every unexpected sound makes my heart leap. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is still, I swear I can hear the faint sound of whispers, just like the ones in that cabin.